November 1998, Tulsa, Oklahoma. David Richter sat alone in his father's bedroom, sorting through the belongings of a man he'd never fully understood. The funeral had been small, quiet, 30 people, maybe less. Neighbors who knew Helmut as the gentle German with the careful way of speaking. Co-workers from the lumber yard who remembered him as precise, reliable, never late in 43 years. Family who loved him but sensed there were rooms inside him they'd never been invited to enter. The closet held pressed shirts on wooden hangers. The dresser held socks folded into perfect squares. Everything in its place. Everything measured and controlled. That had been his father. A man who lived like he was afraid the world might dissolve if he stopped paying attention. David opened the nightstand drawer, reading glasses, a pocket watch that no longer worked, a small Bible in German that looked like it had never been opened. And tucked in the back, a worn leather wallet thin as paper, the kind a man carries for decades until it becomes part of him. He opened it. Behind expired credit cards and a driver's license photo from 1987, he found a photograph. The edges were rounded. The surface was creased from being handled thousands of times, folded and unfolded, taken out and carefully returned. The image itself was simple. A chain-link fence stretched across empty prairie. Beyond it, grass bent beneath wind. The sky was wide and bright. There were no people, no buildings, just space and light, and the fence dividing them. David turned it over. 3 words in his father's precise handwriting. The ink slightly bled with age, "Where I belonged." He stared at those words for a long time. His father had carried this photograph for 53 years, had touched it so often the paper had worn soft, had never once explained what it meant. And now David sat in the silence of that unfinished conversation, holding the answer to a question he hadn't known to ask. He didn't understand it yet, but he would. Before we go further, if you're captivated by the hidden human truths of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. Now let's continue, because this is the story of a boy who weighed 68 pounds when he arrived in America, a boy who was supposed to be an enemy, a boy who discovered that prison could feel safer than home. And when the war ended and the gates opened and freedom was handed back to him, he gripped a fence with white knuckles and begged them not to let him go. This is the story of Helmut Richter and the summer he didn't want to be saved. December 1943, Hamburg, Germany. The Richter apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a brick building in Altona, close enough to the harbour that Helmut could smell the Elbe River on foggy mornings. 4 rooms, high ceilings, windows that rattled when the wind came off the water. His father worked as a foreman at the Blohm and Voss shipyard, managing men who built U-boats for the Kriegsmarine. His mother kept house. His older brother Heinrich was 19, serving somewhere on the Eastern Front. Letters came every few weeks, carefully worded to pass the censors, saying nothing real. Helmut was 13, small for his age, quiet. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's sharp cheekbones. He read books his teachers hadn't assigned. He asked questions his father didn't like. And late at night, when the air raid sirens wailed and the family huddled in the building's cellar, he watched the adults and wondered why they seemed more afraid of admitting their fear than of the bombs themselves. The last normal dinner happened on a Tuesday in December. His father came home late, smelling of grease and salt. His mother had saved rations all week to make something close to a meal. Boiled potatoes, thin slices of bread, a single sausage divided into 4 pieces. They ate in silence because the radio was on, broadcasting news of victories that sounded less convincing each time. Helmut's father speared his piece of sausage and held it up like evidence. "This is sacrifice," he said. "This is what we do for the fatherland. We give so Germany can be great again." Helmut looked at the sausage. It was barely 2 inches long. He thought about the propaganda posters plastered on every street corner. Images of strong-jawed soldiers and fields of wheat and children saluting with joy. He thought about the ration cards that grew thinner every month. He thought about Heinrich's letters that said nothing and meant everything. He didn't say any of this. He just nodded and ate his piece of sausage and felt something inside him begin to separate from the words everyone around him kept repeating. His mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. She didn't say anything either, but her eyes were wet. 3 months later, his father was dead. It happened on a clear afternoon in March 1944. The British bombers came in waves high and silver against the blue. The shipyard was the target. His father was standing near the dry docks when the first bomb hit. They said it was quick. They said he didn't suffer. They said a lot of things that were supposed to make it easier. Helmut stood at the funeral in a black coat 2 sizes too big and watched them lower a coffin into frozen ground. He felt numb. Not sad exactly, just hollow, like someone had reached inside him and scooped out the part that was supposed to feel things. The letters from Heinrich stopped coming in July. His mother didn't tell him right away. She kept checking the mail every day, her hands shaking as she sorted through notices and bills. When the official telegram finally arrived, she sat at the kitchen table and read it 3 times before she folded it and put it in a drawer and never spoke of it again. Heinrich had been killed at a place called Lvov. That was all they knew. No details, no body to bury, just a name crossed off a list somewhere in a government office. Now it was just Helmut and his mother in the apartment that felt too big and too quiet. She stopped cooking real meals. She stopped listening to the radio. She spent hours staring out the window at nothing, her hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. Helmut tried to hold things together. He stood in ration lines. He scavenged coal for the stove. He lied to neighbors about how well they were doing. And at night, he lay in bed and listened to the bombers overhead and wondered when it would be his turn. The answer came in December 1944. He was 14 now, though he'd turn 15 in 2 weeks. Small and thin, his wrists like sticks, his collarbones sharp enough to cut shadows. The Volkssturm had been scraping the bottom of the barrel for months. Old men with trembling hands, boys who hadn't started shaving. Anyone who could hold a rifle was being called up to defend the Reich in its final convulsions. 2 men came to the apartment on a Sunday afternoon. They wore armbands and carried clipboards and spoke in the clipped, efficient tones of people who had stopped thinking of orders as negotiable. "Helmut Richter." He nodded. "You're being conscripted into the Volkssturm. Report to the assembly point at Altona Station tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Bring nothing." His mother stepped between them and her son. She was shaking, but her voice was steady. "He's 14. He's my only child. Please, please don't take him." The younger of the 2 men looked uncomfortable. The older one didn't blink. "Germany needs every able body. Your son is able. He will serve. He's a child." The Führer was clear. Age is no excuse when the fatherland is in danger. His mother grabbed Helmut's shoulders. "Please, I've already lost my husband. I've lost my eldest son. Don't take the last piece of my family." The older man's expression didn't change. "If you interfere with conscription, you'll be arrested. Your son reports tomorrow, 6 o'clock. They left. His mother collapsed into a chair and wept until she had no sound left. Helmut stood in the middle of the room and felt nothing at all. Just that same hollow numbness, like he was watching someone else's life happen to someone else's body. That night she held him for a long time. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. When he finally went to his room, he lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what came next. He couldn't. The future was just a blank space where his mind stopped working. At 5:30 the next morning, he put on his warmest coat and walked to Altona Station. His mother stood at the apartment window and watched him go. He didn't look back. He was afraid if he did, he wouldn't be able to keep walking. There were 60 boys at the assembly point. Some looked younger than him. Some looked older, but were just as scared. They were loaded into trucks and driven to a training camp outside Lüneburg. The training lasted 2 weeks. They were given rifles that were older than they were helmets that slipped over their eyes, uniforms sewn for men twice their size. They learned to march. They learned to dig trenches. They learned to lie flat when artillery whistled overhead. Nobody taught them how to actually fight. There wasn't time. On February 3rd, 1945, Helmut's unit was sent west to slow the American advance near Aachen. The orders were vague. Hold the line, delay the enemy. Buy time for a counter-offensive that everyone knew wasn't coming. They rode in the back of a freezing truck for 8 hours. When they arrived, the landscape was grey and dead. Forests stripped by shelling, roads cratered, villages that were just piles of stone. His unit was assigned to a defensive position in a shallow trench system that had been abandoned by regular Wehrmacht troops 2 days earlier. Helmut crouched in the mud with his rifle and waited. He was so cold he couldn't feel his feet. The boy next to him, a kid from Bremen named Paul, kept muttering prayers under his breath. Another boy vomited into the dirt and couldn't stop shaking. The Americans came at dawn. Helmut heard the tanks before he saw them, a low mechanical rumble that vibrated through the frozen ground. Then the artillery started. The world became noise and fire and dirt raining from the sky. He pressed himself into the bottom of the trench and covered his head and prayed to a god he wasn't sure existed anymore. When the shelling stopped, he looked up. Figures were moving through the smoke. American soldiers, their uniforms clean and new, their faces hard and young. They shouted in English. They fired short, controlled bursts. They moved like they'd done this 1,000 times. An officer in Helmut's unit screamed for them to return fire. A few boys raised their rifles. Most just sat frozen. Helmut lifted his rifle, sighted down the barrel at a soldier 50 meters away, and realized he couldn't do it. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His finger wouldn't pull the trigger. The Americans were in the trench 10 seconds later. "Drop it! Drop the weapon!" Helmut let the rifle fall. He raised his hands. The soldier in front of him was maybe 22 years old, with freckles and red hair, and an expression that looked more confused than angry. He stared at Helmut for a long moment, then shook his head. "Jesus Christ, how old are you?" Helmut didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. The soldier lowered his rifle slightly and called over his shoulder, "Sarge, we got kids here. They're sending kids." Another soldier came over, older, harder. He looked at Helmut and the other boys sitting in the mud with their hands up, and something in his face softened. "Search them. Take their weapons. Get them to the rear." They were herded into a column and marched back through the ruined village. Helmut walked in a daze. He had surrendered without firing a single shot. He was a prisoner of war, and the only thing he felt was relief. That evening, they were processed at a temporary holding area. An American lieutenant who spoke broken German asked their names and ages and wrote everything down in a notebook. When he got to Helmut, he paused. 14, 15 in 2 weeks, Helmut said quietly. The lieutenant stared at him. Then he wrote something in the margin of the notebook and moved on. Later, a different soldier came by with rations. He was young, maybe early 20s, with a flat Midwestern accent and an easy smile. He handed Helmut a chocolate bar without a word. Helmut looked at it. He'd seen chocolate in propaganda films about American decadence. He'd been told the Americans were cruel, that they tortured prisoners, that surrender meant death. The soldier unwrapped his own chocolate bar, took a bite and grinned. "Go on, kid. It's not poisoned." Helmut didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He unwrapped the chocolate slowly like it might explode. He took a small bite. The sweetness hit him from another lifetime. Rich, smooth, real. He hadn't tasted chocolate in 3 years. He ate the rest in 4 bites too fast and felt his stomach cramp from the richness. The soldier laughed and handed him another one. "Save it for later." Helmut held the second bar as if it were made of gold. He looked up at the soldier, trying to form words in a language he didn't know, trying to make sense of a world where enemies gave you chocolate instead of bullets. The soldier just smiled and moved on down the line. That was the first crack. They were held in a series of temporary camps for 2 weeks while the army figured out what to do with them. There were over 200 German child soldiers captured in the push toward the Rhine, too young to be processed as regular POWs, too many to just release. The solution was to ship them to America. On March 10, 1945, Helmut and 193 other boys were loaded onto a Liberty ship called the SS Marine Falcon at the port of Le Havre. The Atlantic crossing took 21 days. They were packed into a cargo hold that smelled of rust and vomit and unwashed bodies. The sea was grey and endless. The ship rolled and pitched. Half the boys were seasick the entire voyage. Helmut wasn't. He spent the journey sitting near a porthole watching the water slide past, trying to imagine what America looked like. He'd seen pictures in magazines, skyscrapers, cars, wide streets. But those were propaganda images meant to show American excess and corruption. He didn't know what was real anymore. One of the other boys, a 15-year-old from Munich named Otto Klein, sat down next to him on the third day out. "You think they'll kill us when we get there?" Helmut shook his head. "I don't think so." "Why not?" "They gave us chocolate." Otto snorted. "So, maybe they fatten us up first." But he didn't sound convinced. None of them did. Because the Americans who'd captured them hadn't acted like the monsters they'd been warned about. They'd been firm, but not cruel. They'd given them food and water and blankets. They'd treated them like prisoners, yes, but also like human beings. It was disorienting. Otto leaned back against the bulkhead. "I'm going to escape the first chance I get. Steal a boat, sail back to Germany, find my family." "And then what? Rebuild? Germany will need people like us to rebuild." Helmut didn't answer. He looked out at the water and thought about Hamburg. The apartment that was probably rubble now. His mother, if she was even still alive. The city where everything he knew had been burned or buried or blown apart. He tried to imagine going back to that. Tried to picture himself standing in the ruins and starting over. He couldn't. On March 31st, the ship arrived in New York Harbor. The boys were transferred to trains. They rode west for 3 days, staring out windows at a country that looked impossibly vast and untouched. No bomb craters, no burned forests, no cities reduced to skeletons, just farmland and small towns and signs in English they couldn't read. They arrived at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma on April 3, 1945. Helmut stepped off the train and looked around. The prairie stretched in every direction, flat and golden under a sky so wide it made him dizzy. The air smelled of grass and dust and distance. There were no ruins, no sirens, no fear pressed into the ground. It was the quietest place he'd ever been. A soldier directed them toward a row of wooden barracks. As they walked, Helmut glanced at the perimeter fence. Chain link 8 feet high, topped with barbed wire, guard towers at the corners. It was a prison. He understood that, but it felt different from the trenches, different from the chaos. There was order here, structure, safety. They were assigned bunks in Barracks 7. Helmut took a bottom bunk near the door. He had no belongings to unpack, just the clothes on his back and the second chocolate bar he'd saved, now melted and rehardened into a misshapen lump. That evening they were called to an assembly in the mess hall. A tall American officer stood at the front of the room. He had graying hair and a calm expression. When he spoke, a German translator repeated his words. "My name is Colonel Raymond Keller. I am the commander of Camp Gruber. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly. You will be fed. You will be housed. And you will be given the opportunity to learn." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces. "I know some of you are scared. I know some of you have been told lies about what Americans do to prisoners. I want to be clear. You are not our enemies. You are children who were caught in a war you didn't start. My job is to make sure you're safe. My job is to give you a chance to be children again." Some of the boys shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at the floor. Helmut listened and tried to decide if he believed it. The colonel continued. Tomorrow morning you'll have your first meal in the mess hall. Then you'll undergo medical examinations. After that you'll begin attending classes. There's a school here run by Dr. Friedrich Steiner. You'll learn English. You'll learn history. You'll learn to think for yourselves. He let that sit for a moment. I lost men in France. Some of the guards here lost brothers. They're angry. They have every right to be. But I've given them an order, and they will follow it. Treat you like kids, not like enemies. Because that's what you are. Kids. The translator finished. The hall was silent. Dismissed. The boys filed out. Helmut walked back to the barracks in a daze. He climbed into his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Colonel Keller's words. He thought about the chocolate. He thought about his mother alone in Hamburg, if she was still alive, if the apartment was still standing, if she even knew where he was. And he thought about the fence, the chain-link barrier between him and the endless prairie, the thing that marked him as a prisoner. It didn't feel like a cage. Not yet. It felt like a line, a border between the chaos he'd left behind and something he couldn't name yet. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Outside, the Oklahoma wind moved through the grass like a whisper. April 4th, 1945. 6 o'clock in the morning. Helmut woke to the sound of a bell ringing across the camp. He sat up disoriented. The other boys were already moving, pulling on clothes lining up at the door. Otto leaned down from the top bunk. Breakfast. Come on. They walked to the mess hall in a loose column. The building was long and low with rows of tables and benches. The smell hit Helmut before he even stepped inside. Salt, smoke, fat, caramelization. Something rich and animal and so foreign to his senses that his knees almost buckled. He got in line. A server behind the counter, a thick-armed man with a stained apron, looked at him and nodded. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. He just scooped food onto a metal tray and handed it over. Helmut stared at what he'd been given. 6 strips of bacon, glistening with grease, edges crispy and dark centers still soft. Scrambled eggs, bright yellow, flecked with black pepper. 2 slices of white bread, thick and soft with butter already melting into the surface. A glass of whole milk, cold and white as snow. He stood there, holding the tray, not moving, just staring. Otto nudged him. You okay? Helmut didn't answer. He walked to a table as if carrying something sacred. He sat down. He picked up a strip of bacon with shaking hands. It was hot. The grease dripped onto his fingers, slick and rich. He brought it to his mouth and bit down. The salt hit first, sharp and clean, waking up parts of his tongue he'd forgotten existed. Then the fat coating his mouth, sliding down his throat like warm silk. Then underneath it all a sweetness, subtle, smoky, the taste of meat that had been cured and cooked with care. He chewed slowly, swallowed, felt the weight of it settle in his stomach. Then he ate another piece, faster this time, then another. He couldn't stop. His hands moved on their own, the bacon, the eggs, the bread soaked with butter. He ate until the tray was empty, until his stomach was tight and full for the first time in 14 months. He looked up. Across the table a soldier sat down, young, maybe 22, with sandy hair and a face that looked like it belonged on a farm. His uniform had a name tape, Burke. Corporal Everett Burke unwrapped a piece of gum and chewed it slowly, watching Helmut. Good, huh? Helmut didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He nodded. Burke smiled. Not mocking, just easy, like this was normal. We got plenty more where that came from. You eat up. Put some meat on those bones. He stood and walked away, still chewing his gum. Helmut sat there alone. His stomach was full, his hands were greasy, and something inside him was breaking apart. That night, he lay in his bunk and couldn't sleep. The other boys were snoring. The barracks were dark. But Helmut's mind was racing. He thought about the bacon, the 6 perfect strips, the butter, the milk, the ease with which it had been given. And then he thought about his mother. The memory came unbidden. January 1945. The last letter he'd received before being conscripted. She'd written in small, careful handwriting on the back of a torn piece of newsprint because there was no paper left. "We are eating what we can find. Potato peels, tree bark boiled soft. Your grandmother tried to make soup from her leather shoes. We are managing. Do not worry." His stomach twisted. He sat up, climbed out of the bunk and stumbled outside. The night air was cold. He bent over and vomited into the dirt behind the barracks. Everything he'd eaten came back up in violent heaves until there was nothing left. He leaned against the wall, gasping, tears streaming down his face. "Hey, you okay, kid?" Helmut looked up. Corporal Burke stood a few feet away, cigarette in hand, expression concerned. Helmut tried to speak. The words came out in German, broken and choked. "I shouldn't be eating this. My mother is dying." Burke didn't understand the language, but he understood the sound. He dropped the cigarette and ground it out with his boot. He walked over and sat down next to Helmut in the dirt. They sat there in silence for a long time. Then Burke spoke quiet and steady. "Your mother would want you to eat. That's what mothers do." Helmut didn't understand the words, but something in the tone reached him. He wiped his face and nodded. Burke stood and offered his hand. Helmut took it. The soldier pulled him to his feet. "Come on, get some sleep." Helmut went back inside. He climbed into his bunk. He lay there staring at the ceiling, and the realization settled over him as a weight. Everything he'd been told was a lie. Germany was superior. The fatherland was strong. The enemies were evil and weak and doomed to fail. But the enemies had so much food they could feed prisoners like guests. They had chocolate to give away. They had bacon and eggs and milk and butter in quantities he couldn't even comprehend. If they lied about this, what else had they lied about? The question sat in his chest like a stone. And as the days passed, it grew heavier. April 1945. Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. The days began to take shape. Structure emerged from chaos. Helmut woke at 6 to the sound of the bell. He ate breakfast in the mess hall, forcing himself not to think about his mother, forcing himself to swallow the food that tasted of guilt. He attended morning assembly in the yard. He went to class, he ate lunch, he had free time in the afternoon, he ate dinner, he slept. It was the most routine he'd experienced in 2 years, and slowly against his will, his body began to remember what normal felt like. By mid-April, he'd gained 13 pounds. His ribs no longer showed through his shirt. His face had colour. The hollowness in his cheeks started to fill in. He caught his reflection in a window one morning and barely recognized himself. He looked less like a corpse and more like a boy. The school was held in a converted warehouse at the edge of camp. Long tables, chalkboards, shelves lined with books in German and English. Dr. Friedrich Steiner ran it with the precision of a man who'd spent his life teaching and refused to let a war change that. Steiner was 55, tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and grey hair that he kept meticulously combed. He'd fled Berlin in 1938 when the laws made it clear there was no future for Jewish academics in the Reich. He'd rebuilt his life in America, teaching at a small college in Kansas. When the army needed someone to educate German child prisoners, he'd volunteered. He stood at the front of the classroom on the first day and looked at the 60 boys sitting before him, some defiant, some frightened, most just exhausted. "My name is Dr. Steiner," he said in German. "I am here to teach you 3 things: English, history, and how to think." A boy in the back snorted. Steiner ignored him. "You have been lied to. Your government lied. Your teachers lied. Your parents in many cases believed the lies and passed them to you. My job is not to tell you what to think. My job is to show you how to question what you've been told." He picked up a piece of chalk and wrote on the board, "Truth does not care whether you believe it. We will start with history, real history, not the version you were taught. We will read newspapers from across the world. We will examine evidence. We will argue. And if you are brave enough, you will begin to see the difference between what you were told and what actually happened. Helmut sat in the third row, hands folded on the desk, and listened. He wanted to resist. Part of him still clung to the stories his father had told. The pride of Germany, the necessity of sacrifice, the glory of the Reich. But another part of him remembered the bacon, the chocolate, the way Corporal Burke had sat with him in the dirt without judgment. The first week of class was English, basic vocabulary, greetings, numbers. Dr. Steiner spoke slowly and made them repeat phrases until their mouths learned the shape of the words. Helmut found he had an ear for it. The sounds came easier to him than to Otto, who struggled with the harsh consonants and strange vowels. "Good morning. How are you? My name is Helmut." Simple things. But each phrase felt like a small betrayal. Learning the enemy's language, speaking their words, letting them into his mouth. The second week they started history. Dr. Steiner brought in newspapers, the New York Times, the Times of London, Swiss papers, French papers. He spread them across the tables and told the boys to read. Look at the dates. Look at what different countries are reporting about the same events. Notice where the stories align and where they contradict. Ask yourselves why. Helmut picked up a copy of the New York Times from March 1945. The headline showed American troops crossing the Rhine. The article described minimal resistance. German forces in disarray. Cities surrendering without a fight. He thought about the propaganda he'd seen in Hamburg. Images of German soldiers fighting valiantly. Reports of victories. Promises that the tide would turn. He set the paper down and felt something crack a little deeper. In the afternoons there was free time. Some boys played soccer on a dirt field behind the barracks. Others sat in small groups and talked in low voices about home. A few, like Otto, spent hours planning escapes that would never happen. Helmut went to the library. It was a small room attached to the school building. 3 walls of shelves, a few tables. A window that looked out at the fence and the prairie beyond. Dr. Steiner had stocked it with books in both German and English. Classics, history, science, philosophy. Helmut started with the German titles because they were easier. He read Goethe. He read Schiller. He read Thomas Mann's essays on Germany and democracy and the corruption of culture by politics. Then he moved to English. He started with children's books to build his vocabulary, then moved to Mark Twain, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, stories about a boy who was free, who ran away, who made his own rules, who lived in a country where the river was wide and the future was open. Helmut read that book 3 times. Each time he felt further from Hamburg, further from the boy who'd stood in a trench with a rifle he couldn't fire, closer to something he didn't have a name for yet. By early May, the routine had softened the edges of his fear. He ate 3 meals a day without vomiting. He slept most nights without nightmares. He spoke basic English with an accent that made Corporal Burke grin. "You're getting good, kid. Keep it up." He played soccer once. Otto dragged him onto the field during afternoon free time. The teams were mixed. German boys and American guards. No one kept score. It was just movement and sweat, and the brief forgetting that came with running. Helmut wasn't athletic. He was still too thin, too slow. But when the ball came to him, he kicked it toward the goal and watched it sail wide. Corporal Burke, playing defense, laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Nice try next time." It was such a small moment. Meaningless, maybe. But Helmut carried it back to the barracks like a secret. The enemy had laughed with him. Not at him. With him. How was he supposed to hate people who treated him this way? May 3rd, 1945. Dr. Steiner stood at the front of the classroom with a stack of newspapers and a box of photographs. His expression was grave. He set the materials on his desk and looked at the boys for a long time before speaking. "Today, we are going to talk about the camps." The room went still. Not the POW camps, not places like this, the other camps, the concentration camps, the extermination camps, the places your government built to murder millions of people. A boy in the front row stood up. "That's a lie. That's American propaganda. Steiner didn't react. He just picked up one of the newspapers and held it up. The headline was in English, but he translated. Allied forces liberate Bergen-Belsen. Thousands dead. Evidence of mass murder. He set it down and picked up a photograph. He held it up so everyone could see. The image showed skeletal bodies stacked like firewood, faces frozen in agony, limbs twisted, eyes open and empty. Several boys looked away. One started to cry. Helmut stared at the photograph and felt his stomach turn to ice. Steiner set the photo down and picked up another. Crematoria. Ovens still full of bones, piles of shoes, mountains of eyeglasses, suitcases with names written in careful handwriting. This is Auschwitz, Steiner said quietly. This is Treblinka. This is Sobibor. This is Dachau. These are the camps your government built. These are the people your government murdered. 6 million Jews, Romani, disabled people, political prisoners, anyone who didn't fit the vision of the master race. Helmut stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. His voice was shaking. No, you're lying. This is propaganda. You're trying to make us feel guilty for something that didn't happen. Steiner looked at him with an expression that was sad, but not angry. I understand, Helmut. I understand why you don't want to believe this, but the truth doesn't care whether you believe it. He walked to the chalkboard and wrote a name. Bergen-Belsen, April 15th, 1945. Liberated by British forces. 60,000 prisoners found, 13,000 corpses unburied. He wrote another. Dachau, April 29th, 1945. Liberated by American forces. 32,000 prisoners found. Evidence of medical experiments. And another. Auschwitz, January 27th, 1945. Liberated by Soviet forces. 7,000 prisoners found. Gas chambers. Crematoria. 1.1 million murdered. He turned back to the class. These are facts, verified by soldiers from 3 different nations, documented by journalists, witnessed by thousands. You can deny them if you want, but that won't make them untrue. He picked up a folder and pulled out a page. He began to read. This is testimony from a British medic at Bergen-Belsen. The smell was overwhelming. Bodies everywhere, many still alive but so starved they couldn't move. We found children who weighed 30 pounds. We found mass graves with thousands of corpses. We found evidence of systematic starvation and murder. Helmut sat down. His hands were shaking. He wanted to argue. He wanted to call it lies. But the photographs were real. The testimony was specific. The dates and numbers were too precise to be fabricated. Steiner set the paper down. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. You did not build these camps. You did not give the orders. But you need to know what was done in your name. You need to understand what happens when people stop questioning, when they accept lies because the truth is too painful. The room was silent. Some boys stared at their desks. Others had tears running down their faces. One boy, a 15-year-old named Klaus, stood and walked out. Steiner let him go. Helmut sat frozen. He thought about his father, the pride in his voice when he talked about Germany's greatness, the certainty that they were fighting for something righteous. Had his father known? Had Heinrich known? Or had they believed the lies too? That night, Helmut couldn't eat dinner. He went back to the barracks and lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. The images from the photographs wouldn't leave his mind. The bodies, the ovens, the shoes. Otto climbed into the bunk above him. You okay? No. You think it's true? Helmut closed his eyes. I don't know. Maybe. If it's true, then what does that make us? Helmut didn't have an answer. He lay awake for hours, listening to the other boys breathe, listening to the wind outside, thinking about his father and his brother and the country he'd been told to love. The question wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The days blurred together. May became routine. Helmut attended classes. He read books. He played soccer once a week. He gained more weight. His body healed. But his mind was a battlefield. He read everything Dr. Steiner gave him. Newspaper accounts of the camps, eyewitness testimony, photos from soldiers who'd been there. And slowly, piece by piece, the wall of denial crumbled. It was real. The camps were real. The murders were real. His government had done this. And he'd worn their uniform. One afternoon in mid-May, he sat in the library alone. The book in front of him was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He'd been trying to read it for 3 days, but his mind kept drifting. Corporal Burke walked in and sat down across from him. "You doing okay, Helmut?" Helmut looked up. "Why are you kind to me?" Burke blinked. "What do you mean?" "I am German. I wore the uniform. I was part of it. Why do you treat me like a person?" Burke leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "You're 15 years old. You didn't start this war. You didn't choose to be conscripted. You're just a kid who got caught in something bigger than you." He paused. "I got a little brother back home. He's 13. When I look at you, I see him. So yeah, I'm going to treat you like a person, because that's what you are." Helmut's throat tightened. He looked down at the book. "What if I did terrible things? Did you?" "No. But I could have, if they'd ordered me to. I don't know if I would have said no." Burke nodded slowly. "That's the question, isn't it? What would we do if we were in your shoes? I like to think I'd resist. But I don't know. Nobody knows until they're tested." He stood up. "What matters now is what you choose to do with the rest of your life. You can't change the past, but you can decide who you're going to be tomorrow." He walked out, leaving Helmut alone with those words. May 8th, 1945. The announcement came over the loudspeakers at noon. The static crackled. Then a voice in English. Then the translator. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over." The mess hall erupted. Some boys cheered. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Otto let out a whoop and threw his arms in the air. Klaus buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Helmut sat at his table holding a fork, staring at nothing. The war was over. Germany had lost. And now what Corporal Burke walked over and sat down across from him. "You don't look happy." Helmut set the fork down. "Because now you'll send me back." Burke's expression shifted. "Back home. To your family." "There is no home." Helmut's voice was flat. "Hamburg is rubble. My mother is missing. My family is dead. What am I going back to?" "But you're German. Germany is your country." Helmut looked at him, really looked at him, and the words came out before he could stop them. "This camp has given me more than Germany ever did. Here I have food, safety, school, a future. What does Germany have? Ash and hunger and guilt." Burke stared at him, mouth slightly open, trying to process something that didn't make sense. "You want to stay here?" "Yes." "But you're a prisoner." "I know." Helmut's voice cracked. "I know what that sounds like. But I feel safer inside this fence than I ever did outside it." Burke didn't say anything. He just sat there looking at this 15-year-old boy who'd just told him that prison was better than freedom. Finally he spoke. "I'll talk to the colonel. I don't know if there's anything we can do, but I'll talk to him." He stood and walked away. Helmut sat alone in the mess hall. Around him boys celebrated or grieved, but he felt neither. Just a cold certainty settling in his chest. They were going to send him back, and he didn't know how to survive that. The rumors started within days. The army was processing repatriation orders. All prisoners of war would be returned to their home countries within 8 weeks. No exceptions. The boys began to fracture. Some, like Otto, were eager to go home. They talked about rebuilding, about finding their families, about being part of Germany's future. Others, like Helmut, felt only dread. One evening, Helmut sat with Otto on the steps outside the barracks. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky orange and gold. "You really want to stay?" Otto asked. "Yes." "Why?" Helmut was quiet for a long time. Then he pointed at the fence. "See that 8 feet of chain link and barbed wire? That fence is supposed to keep me trapped, but when I look at it all I see is a line between me and chaos. On this side I know what tomorrow looks like. On the other side, everything is uncertainty." Otto shook his head. "That's fear talking." "Maybe, but it's also the truth. Germany needs us, Helmut. We're young. We can rebuild." "Rebuild what? The country that murdered 6 million people, the country that sent children to die in trenches. I don't want to rebuild that." Otto stood up angry. "Then what do you want?" "I want to stop being afraid. I want to eat without feeling guilty. I want to wake up in the morning and not wonder if today is the day I die." "You think America will give you that?" "I think this place already has." Otto walked away without another word. By mid-May, 40 boys had written letters asking to stay. They petitioned the Red Cross. They wrote to Congress. They begged for asylum. Helmut spent 3 days writing his letter. He wrote it in English, carefully checking every word in the dictionary Dr. Steiner had given him. "Dear Sirs, my name is Helmut Richter. I am 15 years old. I was conscripted into the Volkssturm in December 1944 and captured by American forces in February 1945. I have been held at Camp Gruber for 2 months. I am writing to ask if I can stay in America. I know this is unusual. I know I am a prisoner of war, but I have no home to return to. My father was killed in 1944. My brother was killed on the Eastern Front. My mother is missing. Hamburg, where I lived, has been destroyed. In this camp I have learned more than I learned in 4 years of German schools. I have been treated with kindness by people I was taught to hate. I have been given food and safety and the chance to think for myself. If I am sent back to Germany, I do not know what will happen to me. There is nothing waiting for me except ruins and starvation. I am asking for mercy. I am asking for a chance. I am asking to stay in the only place I have ever felt safe. Respectfully, Helmut Richter." He gave the letter to Dr. Steiner, who promised to forward it to the appropriate authorities. "I'll do what I can," Steiner said, "but I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that they'll say no." "I know. Helmut, I understand what you're feeling. I left Germany too. But you're a prisoner of war. The Geneva Convention requires repatriation. Even for children." Steiner hesitated. "The law isn't clear. That's what they're trying to figure out." Days passed, then weeks. Other boys received responses. Generic form letters thanking them for their inquiry and informing them that repatriation was mandatory. Churches in Oklahoma began offering sponsorships. Civic groups volunteered to help. Families wrote letters saying they would take in German boys who had nowhere to go. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Then the final decision came down from Washington. Colonel Keller called an assembly on June 6th. He stood at the front of the mess hall and read the order aloud. "All prisoners of war held at Camp Gruber will be repatriated to Germany no later than August 31st, 1945. No exceptions will be made. This decision is final." The room erupted. Boys shouted. Some cursed. Others wept. Otto stood and cheered. Helmut sat frozen. No exceptions. That night he walked to the fence. He stood there for 2 hours, both hands gripping the chain link, staring out at the prairie that stretched forever. Corporal Burke found him there. "You okay, kid?" Helmut didn't turn around. "I don't want to leave." "I know." "Why can't I stay? The war is over. Germany doesn't want me. Why can't I stay where I'm wanted?" Burke was quiet. Then he sighed. "Because it's not up to us. It's the law. Geneva Convention. Every prisoner has to go home." "This is home." Burke put his hand on Helmut's shoulder. "I wish I could change it. I really do. But I can't." Helmut's knuckles turned white against the wire. Burke stood with him for a while. Then he walked back toward the barracks. Helmut stayed. He stood there as the sun set and the prairie turned dark and the stars came out in a sky so wide it hurt to look at. He took a mental photograph. The fence, the grass beyond it, the way the light fell, the feeling of standing on this exact spot. He didn't know why it mattered, but it did. The next morning, Burke found him before breakfast. He handed Helmut a small photograph. "Took this last night. Thought you might want it." It was a black and white image. The chain-link fence, the prairie beyond, empty space and light. Helmut took it carefully. "Why?" "So you remember. This place, this feeling, whatever it meant to you." Helmut looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. "Thank you." Burke nodded and walked away. Helmut went to breakfast. He ate his bacon and eggs. He felt the guilt rise up as it always did. He swallowed it down with the food. 2 more months. That's all he had left. 2 more months before they sent him back to a country that had destroyed him. 2 more months before he lost the only safety he'd ever known. He gripped his fork and tried not to think about what came after. July 1945, Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. The final weeks moved past like water slipping through cupped hands. No matter how tightly Helmut tried to hold them, they disappeared. The calendar on the mess hall wall had dates crossed off in red ink. July 10th, July 15th, July 20th. Each X brought him closer to the ship that would carry him back across the Atlantic. The camp had taken on the hollow quality of a place being abandoned. Some boys had already been transferred to processing centers. Others packed and repacked the few belongings they'd accumulated. Otto spent his days planning what he'd do when he reached Munich. Find his family, rebuild his father's shop, start over in a new Germany. Helmut spent his days at the fence. He'd go there after breakfast and stand for an hour, sometimes 2 hands pressed against the wire, watching the grass bend in the wind. Corporal Burke stopped asking if he was okay. Dr. Steiner stopped trying to convince him that going home was the right thing. They just let him stand there, a 15-year-old boy trying to memorize the feeling of safety before it disappeared. On July 18th, Colonel Keller organized a final dinner. Not a celebration, just an acknowledgement. The mess hall was decorated with nothing because there was nothing to celebrate. But the cooks prepared a meal that went beyond rations. Steak. Actual steak, thick and charred on the outside, pink in the middle. Mashed potatoes with butter pooled in the center. Green beans, rolls with honey, and for dessert, apple pie with ice cream. Helmut sat at his usual table and stared at the food. His stomach was knotted tight. He hadn't been able to eat properly for days. Everything tasted of ash and guilt. Burke sat down across from him. "You need to eat something." "I'm not hungry." "Helmut, when's the last time you had a full meal?" Helmut didn't answer. Burke cut a piece of his own steak and held it up. "This right here. This is the last good meal you're going to get for a while, maybe a long while. You need to eat it." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because it feels like lying." Burke set his fork down. "Lying about what?" "Lying that everything is fine. Lying that I'm okay with this. Lying that going back is the right thing." Helmut's voice cracked. "I don't want to pretend anymore." Burke was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward. "You know what my father told me before I shipped out. He said, 'Take care of yourself first. You can't help anybody if you're dead.' You not eating doesn't change what's going to happen. It just makes you weaker when you get there." Helmut looked at the steak. His hands shook as he picked up his fork. He ate, not because he wanted to, but because Burke was right. He cut small pieces and chewed mechanically and swallowed past the tightness in his throat. The meat was tender, seasoned with pepper and salt, cooked with a care that made it almost painful to taste. And it tasted like goodbye. After dinner, Dr. Steiner stood at the front of the hall. He didn't give a speech. He just looked at the boys, 60 faces that had arrived hollow and frightened and were leaving something different. Not whole, but alive. You came here as prisoners, he said quietly. You leave as students. What you do with that education is up to you. He sat down. That was all. The hall emptied slowly. Boys drifted back to the barracks in small groups, speaking in low voices. Helmut walked alone. He went to his bunk and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Burke appeared in the doorway. Got something for you. He held out a small cloth bag. Helmut sat up and took it. Inside was a book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the same copy Helmut had read 3 times in the library. Thought you might want to finish it, you know, wherever you end up. Helmut opened the cover. On the inside page, Burke had written in pencil, to Helmut, "The river's always there. You just got to find it. E. Burke." Helmut's vision blurred. He closed the book carefully and held it against his chest. "Thank you." Burke nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, you're going to be okay. I don't know how, but you will." "How do you know?" "Because you're still here. After everything, you're still here." He left. Helmut lay back down, holding the book, and tried to believe it. July 23rd, 1945. The trucks arrived at dawn. 6 of them, canvas-covered engines rumbling in the cool morning air. The boys lined up with their small bundles of belongings. Most had nothing. A change of clothes, a book, a letter from home that had somehow survived. Helmut had the photograph of the fence, the book from Burke, and the second chocolate bar he'd saved from the crossing, now melted and re-hardened so many times it was just a shapeless lump wrapped in foil. He didn't know why he'd kept it, but he couldn't throw it away. Colonel Keller stood by the lead truck and shook each boy's hand as they climbed aboard. When Helmut reached him, the colonel held his hand a moment longer. "You wrote a good letter," he said. "I forwarded it all the way to Washington. They read it. It mattered, just not enough. Thank you for trying. Take care of yourself, son." Helmut climbed into the truck. The canvas sides blocked most of the view, but through the gap in the back he could see the camp receding. The barracks, the mess hall, the library, the fence. He watched until it disappeared. The ride to the train station took 2 hours. They were loaded onto passenger cars, not cattle cars, seats with cushions, windows that opened. It was more comfort than Helmut expected, and somehow that made it worse. The train rolled east. 3 days through landscapes Helmut barely registered. Farmland, small towns, cities that hadn't been touched by war, everything clean and whole and impossible. They arrived in New York on July 26th. The ship waiting for them was the SS Marine Raven, another Liberty ship, same as the one that had brought him over. But this time there was no hope in the crossing, just inevitability. The voyage took 12 days. The Atlantic was cold and grey. Helmut spent most of it on deck, watching the water, trying not to think about what waited on the other side. Otto found him on the 8th day out. "You're going to freeze out here." "I don't care." Otto sat down next to him. "I'm scared too." Helmut looked at him. "You said you wanted to go back." "I do, but that doesn't mean I'm not scared." Otto pulled his coat tighter. "What if there's nothing left? What if my family is dead? What if I get there and it's worse than I imagined? Then we survive it, like we survived everything else. You think we can?" Helmut looked out at the water. "I don't know, but we don't have a choice." They sat in silence for a while. Then Otto stood. "You're a good friend, Helmut. I hope you find whatever you're looking for." He walked away. Helmut stayed on deck until the cold drove him below. Years later, Helmut would learn that Otto had made it back to Munich, that he'd found his father's shop in ruins and rebuilt it brick by brick, that he'd married and had children and never spoke of the war, that he'd lived a good life until he died in 1989, just months before the wall came down. But on that cold deck in the middle of the Atlantic, neither of them knew what was coming. They just knew they were heading towards something they couldn't control. August 7th, 1945. The ship docked at Bremerhaven. Helmut stepped onto German soil for the first time in 6 months and felt nothing. No relief, no joy, just emptiness. The port was a wasteland. Cranes lay toppled in the water, fallen giants rusting in the tide. Buildings were hollow shells, windows blown out, walls blackened by fire. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and something rotten underneath. They were processed by British authorities. Names checked against lists, identity papers issued, travel passes distributed based on home cities. Helmut received a pass for Hamburg. The British officer who handed it to him looked tired. Train leaves in 2 hours. Platform 7. Good luck. The train was a wreck. Cracked windows, torn seats, no heat. It took 6 hours to cover a distance that used to take 2. The countryside rolled past in shades of grey and brown. Farmhouses with missing roofs, fields pocked with craters, forests stripped bare by artillery. Helmut stared out the window and thought about Oklahoma, the endless prairie, the wide sky, the fence that had felt like safety. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph Burke had given him. The edges were already starting to wear from being handled. He looked at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and put it back. The train arrived in Hamburg at dusk. Helmut stepped onto the platform and looked around. He didn't recognize the city. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Streets he used to walk were now paths through rubble. Buildings he'd known his whole life were just foundations and broken walls. The cathedral spire that had been visible from his bedroom window was a jagged stump against the sky. He walked toward Altona, following a map in his mind of streets that no longer existed. It took him 3 hours to find the address where his family's apartment had been. It was a pile of bricks. He stood there for a long time, staring at the ruins, trying to picture the building as it had been. The staircase he'd climbed every day, the third-floor window where his mother used to wave goodbye, the kitchen table where they'd eaten that last dinner. All of it was gone, erased, as if it had never existed. A woman walked past carrying a bucket of water. She stopped when she saw him standing there. "Are you looking for someone?" Helmut turned. "My mother, Anna Richter. She lived here." The woman shook her head. "I don't know her, but you can check the refugee lists at St. Nikolai Church. They keep records there." "Thank you." He walked to the church. The walls still stood, but the roof was gone. Inside, exposed to the sky, someone had set up tables and boards. Lists of names were pinned everywhere, thousands of them. People searching for family, people registering themselves as alive, people marking others as dead. Helmut scanned the lists for an hour. His eyes blurred from reading name after name after name. He didn't find his mother, but he found his grandmother, Margareta Richter. Last known location, displaced persons camp near Lübeck. He took a train there the next day. The camp was a collection of tents and temporary barracks surrounded by mud, hundreds of people living in limbo waiting for somewhere to go. He found his grandmother in a tent near the eastern edge. She was 72 years old and looked 90. Her hair was white. Her hands shook. Her eyes were hollow. She didn't recognize him at first. "Grandmother, it's me, Helmut." She stared at him for a long moment. Then her face crumpled and she pulled him into her arms. She was so thin he could feel every bone in her back. She held him and wept and didn't let go for a long time. When she finally released him, she stepped back and looked at him. "You left as a boy. You came back as something else. Where's Mama?" His grandmother's expression changed. She sat down on a wooden crate and motioned for him to sit beside her. "Your mother is alive. She's in the Soviet zone, near Rostock." "Can I go to her?" "No, the border is closed. The Soviets control everything east of here. No one gets in or out." Helmut felt something crack inside his chest. "Is she okay?" "I don't know. She sent word through the Red Cross 6 weeks ago. Just a message. She's alive. She's trying to survive. And she said—" His grandmother's voice broke. She said if you came back, don't try to find her. Go west if you can. Don't waste your life returning to this. Helmut stared at the ground. His mother was alive, less than 200 kilometers away, and he couldn't reach her. She ate tree bark so you could live, his grandmother said quietly. Don't make that meaningless by dying here too. What am I supposed to do? Live, go west, find work, build something, and when the borders open, if they ever do, then you find her. That night, Helmut lay on a thin mattress in his grandmother's tent and stared at the canvas ceiling. He thought about Oklahoma, about bacon and books and Corporal Burke and the fence, about the safety he'd felt inside a prison and the terror he felt now free. He pulled out the photograph and looked at it in the dim light. Where I belonged. The words weren't written yet, but he was starting to understand them. The next 8 years were a blur of survival. Helmut stayed in Hamburg. He cleared rubble for food. He scavenged bricks and sold them to builders. He attended night school and learned carpentry. He studied English in secret reading the book Burke had given him until the pages fell apart and he had to tape them back together. He applied for a visa to America in 1947. It was denied. Germany was still occupied. Borders were still closed. He applied again in 1949. Denied. Cold War restrictions. He applied again in 1951. Denied. Quota full. Each rejection was a knife. But he didn't stop. He saved money. He learned the trade. He waited. In 1952, the rules changed. West Germany established diplomatic relations with the United States. The Eisenhower administration eased immigration restrictions. Helmut applied a 4th time. In March 1953, the letter arrived. Your application for immigration to the United States has been approved. He was 23 years old. He'd been waiting for this for 8 years. He sold everything he owned. He bought a ticket on a passenger liner. He said goodbye to his grandmother, who held his face in her shaking hands and whispered, "Find your happiness." He boarded the ship with one suitcase, the book from Burke, and the photograph of the fence. April 1953, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Helmut stepped off a Greyhound bus into a city he'd never seen, but somehow felt familiar. Wide streets, clean buildings, the smell of oil refineries and prairie grass. He found a boarding house that rented rooms by the week. He found a job at a lumberyard within 3 days. The foreman looked at his hands, saw the calluses from 8 years of construction work, and hired him on the spot. You know your way around wood? Yes, sir. You show up on time? Yes, sir. Then you start Monday. The work came easy. His hands knew wood the way some men knew engines or earth. English took longer, but he practiced every night reading newspapers aloud until his accent softened. Within 2 years, he'd saved enough for a car, a used Chevrolet, that rattled but ran. And one morning at the diner down the street, he met a girl named Lorelei who laughed at the way he pronounced coffee and didn't stop smiling for the rest of his shift. She had red hair and freckles and a directness that reminded him of the Oklahoma prairie, no hidden things, just wide-open honesty. She didn't ask about the war right away. She just poured his coffee and made conversation about the weather and the baseball scores and whether he preferred apple pie or cherry. They married in 1955. Small ceremony, a few friends, the foreman from the lumberyard, the landlady from his boarding house. Lorelei wore a simple white dress and carried daisies. Helmut wore the only suit he owned and couldn't stop smiling. They had 2 children, a son in 1956, a daughter in 1959. Helmut became a U.S. citizen in 1960. He stood in a courthouse and raised his right hand and swore allegiance to a country that had once been his enemy and was now his home. That evening he tried to find Corporal Everett Burke. He wrote to the Department of Defense. He searched military records. He wanted to tell the man who'd given him a photograph and a book that he'd made it, that he'd found his river. The reply came 6 weeks later. Corporal Burke had been killed in Korea in 1951. He was 28 years old. He'd never married. He was buried in Iowa, not far from the farm where he'd grown up. Helmut sat with that letter for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer with the photograph. Another ghost. Another person who'd saved him and never knew. He built a quiet life, deliberate, measured. He went to work. He came home. He ate dinner with his family. He read books. He never spoke German again, even when he met other immigrants who tried to start conversations in the old language. Once in 1962, he wrote a letter to Dr. Friedrich Steiner in care of the college in Kansas. He didn't know if the man was still alive. He just wanted to say thank you. The letter came back marked, "Addressee deceased." No other information, just those 2 words. Helmut kept the returned letter, another debt he could never repay. And every year on June 8th, he drove to the place where Camp Gruber had once stood. The barracks had been demolished in 1947. The fence had been torn down in 1950. There was nothing left but empty prairie and a historical marker that mentioned the camp in 3 sentences. Helmut would park his car on the side of the road. He would walk to the spot where he thought Barracks 7 had been. He would stand there for an hour, sometimes 2, just looking at the grass and the sky. He never told anyone why he went. Not Lorelei, not his children. When they asked, he just said he was visiting an old memory. In 1990, the Berlin Wall fell. Helmut was 60 years old. He tried to find his mother. He wrote letters to agencies in Germany. He searched records. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. He opened it at the kitchen table while Lorelei made coffee. Inside was a photocopy of a death registry from Rostock. Anna Richter, born 1905, died February 14, 1967. Cause pneumonia. He read it 3 times. His mother had been dead for 23 years. She'd died in winter alone in the Soviet zone, never knowing if her son had survived, never knowing he'd made it back to America, never knowing he'd honored her final wish. She'd told him to go west, to build a life, to not waste what she'd sacrificed to give him. And he had. He'd done exactly that. But she'd never known. Helmut set the paper down. Lorelei came over and put her hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She just stood there while he sat at the kitchen table and wept for the first time in 40 years. For his mother who'd eaten tree bark so he could live. For his father who'd believed the lies. For his brother who'd died believing them. For a country that had destroyed itself and everyone in it. And for a 15-year-old boy who'd stood at a fence in Oklahoma and begged to stay because it was the only place that had ever felt safe. He wept until there was nothing left. Then he folded the death certificate and put it in the drawer with Corporal Burke's returned letter and Dr. Steiner's undeliverable envelope and the photograph of the fence. The drawer where he kept the people he couldn't save. November 1998. Helmut Richter died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning. He was 69 years old. He died in his sleep in his bed in the house he'd owned for 33 years. The funeral was small. Lorelei, their children, grandchildren, neighbors, a few men from the lumberyard. The pastor said kind things about a man who'd worked hard and loved his family and lived a quiet, honorable life. They buried him in a cemetery on the edge of Tulsa, 47 miles from where Camp Gruber had stood. David Richter sat in his father's bedroom holding the photograph of a chain-link fence and an empty prairie. He turned it over and read the 3 words written on the back. Where I belonged. And finally, he understood. His father hadn't belonged in Hamburg. He hadn't belonged in the ruins of a country that had destroyed itself. He hadn't belonged in the displaced persons camps or the night schools or the years of waiting. He'd belonged in a prison in Oklahoma, where for the first time in his life, someone had treated him with kindness, where he'd been fed and taught and allowed to be a child, where a fence had marked the line between chaos and safety, and when they'd forced him to leave, when they'd sent him back to a wasteland he'd spent 8 years fighting to return, not to America exactly, but to the feeling he'd had standing at that fence, the feeling of being wanted, of being safe, of having a future. He'd carried that photograph for 45 years, touched it thousands of times, worn the edges soft, and never explained it to anyone because some things are too big for words. David set the photograph down carefully. He looked at his father's belongings. The pressed shirts, the folded socks, the Bible in German that had never been opened. A life lived with precision and control because chaos was always one mistake away. He picked up the photograph again and looked at the fence, the prairie, the light. And he thought about the boy who'd weighed 68 pounds when he arrived in America, who'd eaten bacon and vomited from guilt, who'd learned that enemies could be kind, who'd begged to stay in prison because freedom meant being sent back to hell. That boy had survived. He'd rebuilt. He'd found love and work and family. He'd lived 70 years and died peacefully in his sleep. But part of him had never left that fence in Oklahoma. Part of him had spent 53 years standing there, fingers threaded through wire, staring at a prairie that meant safety. David folded the photograph and put it in his pocket. He would keep it. He would hold it the way his father had held it. And maybe someday he would understand it even better. In the end, Helmut Richter was one of 30 German child soldiers who returned to America after being repatriated in 1945. Some came as immigrants, some as students, a few as tourists who never left. They built quiet lives in the heartland. They worked, they married, they raised children, they became Americans in every way that mattered. But none of them ever forgot the summer of 1945. The summer they were prisoners who didn't want to be freed. The summer they learned that home isn't where you're born. Home is where you're saved. Home is where someone treats you with kindness when they have every reason not to. Home is where you're allowed to be human again. And sometimes home is just a fence on a prairie, a line between chaos and safety, a place you carry in your pocket for 53 years because it was the only place you ever truly belonged. Helmut's headstone in Tulsa is simple. His name, his dates. An American flag planted next to it on holidays. The inscription reads, Helmut Richter, 1929 to 1998. Immigrant, father, free man. 47 miles away, the prairie where Camp Gruber once stood rolls on forever. The fence is long gone. The barracks are dust. But if you stand in the right spot on a June morning, when the light is just right, you can almost see it. A 15-year-old boy, hands pressed against wire, staring at a future he was terrified to leave, trying to memorize the feeling of safety, trying to hold on to the only home he'd ever known. Because sometimes the cage is safer than freedom. Sometimes the enemy shows you more kindness than your own people. And sometimes you spend the rest of your life carrying a photograph of the place you weren't allowed to stay, where you belonged.